Tonight, we won't unroll scrolls or weigh legends against each other. Instead, we'll stand where wind lifts limestone dust like memory trying to stay visible. A city exhales across centuries, and the air still carries a faint taste of salt, ink, and rumor. Somewhere below this quiet harbor, a gate once turned on iron hinges, and the sound was mistaken for history waking up. Beneath the stone, a traveler sleeps, a body sealed in honey, a story sealed in pride, and each new empire builds another layer of forgetting above him. Streets shift, maps rewrite themselves. What was once a tomb becomes a compass no one means to follow. So dim the lights. Let the echo of those corridors settle beside you. And if your breath begins to slow with the rhythm of sand against stone, that's the city remembering itself. Somewhere beyond that breath, a caravan begins to move slow, deliberate, like thought turning into memory. The wheels creak in the dust. The air tastes faintly of bronze and honey. Each step forward leaves a mark softer than footsteps, but heavier than time. You can almost hear the silence following the cart, adjusting its pace, careful not to wake the dead too soon. And so the story begins not with conquest, but with a road and a body learning how to be carried home. The cortege turns toward Egypt because a general with a current address in Macedonia decides that the most important thing about a body is where it will be visited. It is a logistical opinion dressed as devotion. Memphis receives the guest first, the way a train station receives a letter before forwarding it. The courtiers trade whispers like receipts. Priests practice a new name in a careful whisper to make sure it doesn't bump into the old ones. Memphis understands temporary things. It has warehouses and cranes and men who shout at boats in a friendly way. They slide the coffin where it can be seen and counted. There is a brief debate about whether to polish the lampstands with oil or with lemon. Oil, someone says, because lemon is for fish. Behind the statue hall, a scribe sketches the route the procession took on a wax tablet, and then smears it flat with his thumb, which is how so many ancient maps were lost, to tidy habits. When the new city at the mouth of the Nile calls, it does not shout. It smiles the way a ledger smiles at a new column. Alexandria is a rehearsal of the future performed right next to the sea. Its shrine is built bright and hard, and somehow both simple and not. A house for the body, which people call the Summa, with a casualness that takes centuries to warm up. Visitors file in, and in again, until the line becomes the street, and the street becomes the quarter. First there is a coffin of gold, and later there is one of glass, and then, because someone is always rethinking clarity, there is an even clearer box in which a thick, royal stillness sits like a second embalming. We are told that lamps burn constantly, which is another way of saying that apprentices learn to trim wicks without waking the wax. A market grows against the temple walls because olives and reverence often shop in the same hour. A boy with a tray of fig cakes develops a reliable patter, the way street vendors do, one for the hero, one for the road. The Summa becomes a direction as much as a destination. Ask anyone in the city the way to the harbor, the books, or the body, and you will get 3 different hand motions that somehow all mean the same turn. Emperors begin to behave like pilgrims, which surprises nobody more than the emperors. Julius Caesar steps in during trouble and pauses, not so much out of awe as out of that practical, busy admiration he reserves for well-run rooms. Augustus leaves a flower with the serious face of a man signing a modest decree about modest flowers. Later, rulers bring gifts measured in rumor. Caracalla arrives with a cloak that chirps with embroidery. The fabric is heavy with what it is meant to mean. They peer through panes, each seeing a version of themselves that has been pressed gently by time's thumb. One of them sighs and makes a note about taxes. The older attendants ignore this because sighs are not a line item. With each imperial visit, the shrine becomes a kind of mirror where power checks its posture. The guards keep faces as neutral as chess pieces. The visitors keep hands carefully at their sides. Hundreds of sandal solace memorize the pattern of the pavement, the way your feet learn the distance from bed to kettle. Around the tomb, Alexandria breathes like a harbor, tar, rope, salt, and a very faint perfume of old cedar. Processions pass so routinely that bystanders begin to hum the pace like a song you hear in shops. The shrine is temple, museum, archive, and traffic circle. A guide asks for directions, points left at the colonnade and right at the king, which is a charmingly unhelpful kind of accuracy. When the wind is right, incense decides to be part of the street. A woman stops and stares at the lamp glass and tries to see herself in it the way we all look for defensible reflections. Not far away, an olive seller argues gently with his own weighing scale. If cities had memory palaces, this one has a shining box in the center, and everything else keeps its keys on a hook by that door. Then cities do what they have always done when they are built on old ground with lively weather. They rebuild and rename. The earth moves. Fires move faster. The building falls and rises like a breath that never quite matches the previous one. Streets are repaved and politely shifted. Passages are walled up in the architectural equivalent of shrugging. A saint with new paperwork takes over a chapel. An edict suggests, then insists, that ceremonies look a little different now. The lamps keep burning, fewer and then fewer, until one night there is a quiet that even the watchmen notice. The final secret of stone is how well it keeps the sound of being left alone. Our sources from these changes are people with pens who are not paid by the word, but wrote as if they were. They list corners and chapels with careful, uncertain hands. A Venetian traveler outlines a sealed chamber with confidence, and then backtracks with more confidence. An Arab chronicler notes marble steps that go down too far for comfort and smiles with his ink. A monk says that under one church there are older bones that never learned the new hymns, and he says it in the tone of someone reporting a domestic matter, not a miracle. Each clue is independently luminous and collectively foggy. You can hold any single one and feel heat, and then try to warm your hands on all of them at once, and realize you are holding a basket of stars and none of the handles meet. People love certainty the way cats love sun-worn ledges, so the city recruits it where it can. It renames things. It moves doorways by the width of an elbow. It pretends that silence was always the plan. The shrine becomes a process, not a place. Scholars start saying the word, probably, with the long patience of a person folding a blanket. Tourists, such as they are in the Middle Ages, ask where the conqueror sleeps and are told a useful fraction of the truth. Deep in the archive, a scribe is instructed to copy an old list and instead draws a little fish for no reason any of us will ever know, which is how a certain alley gets a new nickname. The modern hunt does not begin dramatically. It begins the way many hunts do, with a map that does not quite fit the ground. The ancient district called the Bruchium is triangulated like a modest crime scene. Archaeologists lay rulers over fragments, then lay their hands over the rulers to keep them from slipping. Shards of pottery speak in numerals if you ask nicely. Drains and walls offer directions grudgingly, the way an old dog offers you the spot it will accept pats. Someone brings a notebook to a garden and leaves with a suspicion about the angle of a wall that has no business being angled. The Charlotte Gardens, green and innocent, give up masonry that aligns with nothing modern, which is one of the best kinds of alignment. A jogger running past an excavation pit learns to nod with academic decorum because the archaeologists are there, so often it feels like church. To the west, a ruined city named Taposiris Magna contributes a rumor in limestone. Perhaps the story wandered farther than we thought. The desert sips its own archives nightly. Dunes are excellent librarians, very quiet, very sure you're done with a book. Trenches are dug. The smell of dust competes amiably with the smell of lunch. A shard of glass from a late period looks, for a drowsy moment, like an answer, and then returns to being a shard of glass from a late period. The city listens. It sits on its blocks with the indifference of a cat politely not sitting on a book. Scholars write papers with titles that could double as lullabies, notes toward a possible alignment, observations on a potential corridor, indications. With caution, there is a charming theory that if the tomb moved once, it did so twice and for the same reason, respect bundled with convenience. A chain of careful reburials could produce a necklace of presents, each bead linked by ceremony and municipal good sense. The last place might be almost nothing, a chapel under a house, an alcove behind an altar, a space protected by the armor of uncertainty itself. After all, the easiest spot to hide a legendary thing is where people are tired of legends. Preservation by boredom is a real strategy. Libraries use it all the time. Imagine the shrine now as a set of polite absences. The priest knows the place to put the lamp. The custodian knows which step to skip because it sighs. The city knows how to walk around a space that is not entirely there, the way you skirt a puddle even after it has dried. If you are still with me, the glass is clear enough to see your blink. The honey in the first jar has crystallized in a way beekeepers would find interesting. The cloak with embroidery has long since folded itself into the soil with the professionalism of expensive cloth. Emperors have stopped dropping by. Tourists have started and then stopped. A catalog of marble fragments rests like a sleeping sheepdog on a scholar's dining table. Coins pass through auction houses wearing the face of the conqueror and the softness of being handled too much. These are the small, factual crumbs that lead nowhere in particular and everywhere a little bit. I like the market around the shrine, which is gone and also not gone. The olive seller is still arguing with his scale, but now he is a footnote. The fig cake boy has become a formula for calculating crowd flow. The lamp trimmer is a cautionary tale and a safety briefing about fire. Very little of this will bring you to the door. Much of it will teach you how doors behave. Some afternoons when the sun angles off the sea and the gulls complain with bureaucratic zeal, you can stand over a patch of lawn and feel not a presence, but a familiar, well-organized absence, as if the city keeps important emptiness in a ledger. Emptiness, if catalogued thoroughly, is a kind of property. We could press closer and talk about earthquake catalogs and the way late antique masonry likes to reuse earlier stones the way modern people reuse passwords, which is understandable and inadvisable. We could count the canals. We could describe glass clarity and micron thicknesses and admire the practicality of replacing gold with something you can see through. There is a lovely, slow fact about ancient window glass. It flows so lazily that after a few centuries, it dreams of being thicker at the bottom. The shrine's panes, if any survived in any corridor under any church, would be a lesson in patience you could hold to the light. Assuming, of course, there were light and a corridor and panes. A curator once wrote that the best way to keep a relic safe is to make people very sure it is somewhere else. Another suggested labeling a cupboard brooms and leaving it at that. My favorite theory is that the tomb did exactly what Alexander spent his life doing. It went where it was useful. To the city, to the rulers, to the people who needed a landmark to stretch a story over. And then, when usefulness began to look like trouble, it did what many useful things do at the end of their job. It retired to a quiet office behind a quiet door and let the mail pile up. At this point, you may notice how soft the room has become. The harbor wind is far away. The iron gate is oiled. The gold leaf you thought you saw in a crack was probably a sliver of afternoon. If you are awake, you are keeping very still. If you are asleep, you have made the correct decision. The series will continue, one gentle puzzle at a time, with the same respectful attention we give to mislabeled drawers and slow stairs. You can follow if you like, or let the map fold itself. Before we let the city dim its lamps, a last small, tidy note. Maps remember what we tell them to remember. When streets change, maps say, of course, as if it were their idea. The mausoleum that moved cities became a little lesson inside the atlas. The lesson goes like this. A place may be a body for a while, and then it may become a habit, and then a direction, and then a story, and then a kind of gravity that guides feet without explaining itself. Somewhere under a garden or a chapel, or a block of apartments that smells like soup and soap, the careful emptiness rests like a sealed envelope. Dust has settled, notes are filed. The conqueror keeps walking the map, not loudly, not even visibly, but in that quiet administrative stride that paperwork understands. And we, with pleasant diligence, keep reading the corridors, which is almost the same as finding them and exactly right for bedtime. You might not expect a red wooden ball on a stick to keep ships from bumping into reefs, but for more than a century, a single sphere falling once a day told half the world what time it was. It is a very quiet sort of drama, the kind that arrives at 1 o'clock precisely and then ends by hitting a roof. The Greenwich Time Ball is not a celebrity. It is a habit built from paint, rope, and a wing that always has opinions. If you're still listening in a few minutes, feel free to subscribe for more content about objects that move exactly once and then need a nap. But honestly, don't hurry. The ball never did. Each morning, the keepers of time perform chores that feel like the prelude to making tea, except nothing gets poured. The shutters at the Royal Observatory open with that soft scrape old wood prefers. The astronomer's assistant walks across planked floors that have kept the memory of more polished shoes. In a side room, a chronometer, which is essentially a punctual pocket watch with ambitions, ticks in polite, steady syllables. The assistant checks the telegraph line that connects Greenwich to London and to everywhere London has decided to be connected to. He tests the galvanometer, which is a device that could be described as a needle on a mission. He glances at the sky the way bakers glance at ovens, not in fear, but in that respectful way one looks at a collaborator. A gust nudges the window and says the weather will try its best not to interfere, which is British for please don't count on me. The ball itself waits on the mast like a sleepy berry. Its red paint is a reminder to look up without straining. A leather strap and a length of line keep it precisely not falling. At 12:55 p.m., a hand pulls the line to raise the ball to half-mast, which is not a message of mourning, but of mild anticipation. People in the park notice, the way you notice the kettle beginning to think. A nurse with a prom checks her own watch just to be sure it is still behaving. A pair of boys hold a competition to see who can stare without blinking until the drop. A sailor on leave ignores all of this because sailors on leave have other schedules, and that is fine. The ball forgives casual attendance. At 12:58, up it goes to the top, and the mast becomes a very thin exclamation mark. A minute is a long time when everyone is practicing the art of waiting. You can fit very small thoughts into 60 seconds. For example, is the ball heavier on humid days, and if so, does it land with a slightly wetter sound? The record does not say, but minds at rest are free to wander. The clever part is not the paint or even the falling. The clever part is the way the ball listens to a signal that listens to a star. Every day, astronomers fix their telescopes on a particular point where the sky's clockwork nods politely to human math. Noon is measured not by someone's mood, but by where the Earth has rotated to, which is refreshingly objective for a planet that spends half its time asleep. The time is relayed by telegraph to the little switch that will release the line. Some days, if the line crackles with atmospheric mischief, the keeper flips it by hand, which is also good science, redundancy in a waistcoat. In older centuries, before wires and needles were domesticated, sailors brought the time to sea in a wooden box with a gold core called a marine chronometer, then rocked it across oceans while muttering supportive things to it. The ball was simpler. It dropped. The fall said now, and people stood very close to now without getting in its way. At 1 precisely, the ball falls with dignified smallness. is not dramatic. It does not bounce or flourish. It performs a professional descent and then stops because roofs are persuasive. All around, watches are pinched, cocked, nudged, and convinced to behave. In a nearby clockmaker's window sits a collection of faces waiting for hands. An apprentice who has been promised soup counts the seconds before tightening a screw, as if accuracy were a seasoning to be added at the end. Down by the river, a tugboat captain checks his brass clock against the ball, because the fog likes to tell lies and brass does not. A journalist, late for lunch, makes a note about the crowd and writes the word punctually twice, just to be safe. The ball puts its red head down like a satisfied horse and becomes scenery again. There is a paradox about daily rituals. The more precise they are, the more gently they blur into memory. People watch the ball so many times that single afternoons become a friendly pile. Somewhere in the 19th century, a young clerk writes to his sister that he has stood on the hill 5 days running and believes the ball is 2 heartbeats slower on Thursdays. The sister, wiser, replies that his heart is 2 heartbeats faster on Thursdays because of the pie shop on the way home. Microfacts accumulate and then drift. Someone swears the ball squeaks in spring. Someone else remembers a Monday when nothing happened because lightning had opinions about circuits. In the logbook, a line records 1 o'clock no-drop storm with the calm of a grocer noting they're out of pears. And so, around this 1 o'clock drop, small empires of habit form. In the park, a man times his cigarette to the minute marks. He does not like to be both late and ashless. Children in stiff collars learn that waiting can be fun if there is an object at the end of it. A pair of amateur photographers attempt the respectable madness of catching the ball midair with a shutter that moves like molasses through formality. They never quite succeed and consider themselves artists. Vendors discover that sewing umbrellas near a time ball is more lucrative than sewing ice because the main emotion generated by punctuality is, curiously, the desire to be indoors. The observatory cat, whose name is Haddock for reasons both obvious and unclear, develops a personal routine of lying on the warm floorboards from 12:58 to 1:03, which greatly increases the staff's respect for thermostable mammals. Whole afternoons shape themselves around that tidy plop of red. The sound, when you can hear it, is a soft thunk like a desk drawer closing on good manners. Beyond the hill, the signal radiates with shy authority. On ships anchored in the Thames, officers peer through spyglasses to watch the fall, and then scuttle below to reassure their chronometers that life is not chaos. In London, shopkeepers who love a good excuse shout to apprentices to run and look. It's dropping, before insisting they report back immediately with the exact second, which they will later disregard in favor of closing when all the customers have left. The telegraph carries the Greenwich pulse to other towns where engineers have erected their own time balls that salute the mother ball like cousins at a reunion. In ports far away, where noon hides under clouds, a cannon or a siren will mark the hour for anyone whose watches are weather sensitive. You can imagine a map of these little practices stitched together by wires, smoke, and punctual habits, the way a quilt is decorated with repeated red circles that each mean now. If you climb the hill on a winter day, your breath pacing you in visible commas, you can picture how sailors once steered their whole livelihoods by small predictabilities. Before radio, before satellites, a ship's position was half a matter of mathematics and half a conversation with the sky. Longitude, the trickier half of the conversation, depended on knowing what time it was somewhere you were not. By checking noon on the ship against the time in Greenwich preserved inside a chronometer, navigators could sketch their east-west position with scandalous accuracy for people who were simultaneously boiling potatoes. The time ball made sure the pocket worlds inside those wooden boxes agreed, at least for the first few days, with the kindly certainty of a hill in rope. Every drop was a handshake between a city of terraces and a sea of mistakes. Some afternoons, accuracy meets weather in the odd little duel that British engineers accept as a daily vitamin. When the wind is sharp, the ball sways like a patient thinking about excuses. Rain sits on the wood and adds an ounce of melancholy. Tourists who know just enough to be disappointed ask whether the ball might be made to drop with fireworks or at least a cheer. The keeper, who loves all visitors equally, explains that the point of the thing is its indifference to spectacle. There is a decorative weather vane nearby that is only incidentally correct. The time ball is the opposite, intentionally plain and eagerly right. It drops whether kings are crowned or sandwiches are unwrapped. It is, in a sense, the least dramatic public performance in London, which is precisely why ships trust it. By the 20th century, another habit arrives to stand next to the ball, like a younger sibling who talks faster. Radio time signals begin chirping into receivers on ships and in cabinets, modest little beeps that allow accuracy to visit without leaving the house. The ball keeps dropping because it is unwise to fire the staff of tradition all at once. Landlubbers love the radio because it permits synchronizing over toast. Sea captains love it because it works in fog as thick as porridge. The ball enters a phase of dignified redundancy, like a retired civil servant who still wears a hat out of respect for weather and precedent. Tram drivers still glance at it. Lovers still arrange to meet after the drop because romance, too, benefits from at least one definite thing per day. A man who sells newspapers under the hill sets his watch at 1, and then gets distracted by a crossword and ends up setting it again at 2, which is not the ball's fault. There is a brief, charming period when the time ball becomes a tourist object with a touch of sport. People try to guess the exact instant of impact with whispered wagers and the delicious gravity of small stakes. A woman with a parasol invents a method for predicting the fall by watching the keeper's posture. She is right 3 days out of 5, which is better than fate. An American visitor who has read about the ball in a magazine expects it to be the size of a carriage wheel and is disappointed by its modesty. He recovers by purchasing a biscuit tin with an observatory printed on it. Children write small essays titled The Time Ball for School, which is the literary genre that has preserved more of British history than wars ever did. One boy describes the act of waiting so carefully that you feel his socks itching. The rhythms of the place start to press into the language. People say, I'll be there by the ball, and everyone understands that to mean not a minute before or after. The phrase on the ball develops elsewhere, but feels as if it belongs on this hill. The newspapers report that the ball failed to drop only a handful of times in decades, and they do it with a tone usually reserved for rainfall totals. When a war arrives, the hill grows new fences and new duties, and the ball keeps falling as if to say that even in complicated years, sandwiches still happen at 1. In the archives, a file labeled Ball Maintenance Paint Schedule records a tranquil parade of reds with names like Sovereign Scarlet and Cautious Vermilion. Somewhere between layers, a small insect rests forever, an exoskeleton full of punctuality. You may be wondering how one object can be so very ceremonious and so very ordinary at the same time. The trick is repetition. The brain, which is a soft detective, learns to enjoy a solved mystery every day. People come to the hill for birthdays or because a cousin from Leeds needs occupying. They tell themselves they will stay just the once and end up returning because the ball is a sort of miniature New Year, only daily and not exhausting. There's always that curious hush at 12:59, the kind that makes you suddenly aware of your own shoes. Then the fall, then the soft hum of watches and conversations recommencing, and the park opens like a yawn. It is not thrilling, it is kind. The feeling is similar to those digital clocks that jump their minute numbers with a clandestine hiccup, except here, the hiccup controls a fleet. From a modern sofa, you might ask why people cared so much about the tiny discrepancies of minutes and seconds. The answer is that when the rest of life refuses to be precise, one exact thing can be a very comfortable chair. Bakers could decide when to remove bread without arguing with clouds. Tram schedules could be printed as if they meant it. In the Docklands, cranes swung in coordination, and loading crews developed a talent for being hungry at the same time. And beyond the city, longitude continued to be coaxed into reason, a polite line on a map that turned ocean from guesswork into routine. Today, phones whisper time into pockets constantly, and still the ball drops for those who enjoy accuracy with scenery. The hill also collects small legends the way wool collects spurs. There is the tale of a proposal that required perfect timing and was slightly off because the gentleman's nerves ran faster than gravity. There is the rumor that a pair of parrots in a nearby boarding house learned to squawk now at exactly 1 o'clock and continued to do so long after moving to an inland town, confusing pedestrians and establishing a tiny colony of Greenwich time in a place with more cows than clocks. There is the story of a watchmaker so stubborn about his own regulator that he turned away during the drop for 40 years, thereby achieving originality without changing anything. None of these legends affect the ball. That is their charm. If you linger into the afternoon, you will notice how quickly the hill forgets drama. The mast stands with the posture of a rake in a shed. The staff closes shutters, writes numbers, performs the kind of paperwork that keeps the universe from coming apart. The park returns to joggers, dogs, and people answering letters in their heads. Somewhere a child practices a speech that begins, "What is time?" and ends with biscuits. The telegraph wires hum with other news. The cat relocates to a windowsill that has studied sunlight since the late 17th century. And yet, at 12:55 tomorrow, the entire choreography resets without apology or fanfare. You can set your dinner by it, and many have. Once, during maintenance, the ball was taken down, and an emptiness occupied its place with excellent manners. Visitors felt a photon of disappointment and then did what humans are so good at. They invented a temporary tradition in which everyone checked their watches not against an object, but against the unanimity of other people checking their watches. Strangers nodded like colleagues. A child shouted, "One," at one, which is the most correct behavior possible. When the ball returned, it discovered it had not been missed so much as honored by imitation. That would have pleased it if objects experience pride, which they do not, except in a metaphorical way that keeps essays employed. It is possible, if you enjoy these kinds of thoughts, to imagine the time ball dreaming. In its dreams, it counts ships slipping from the river like commas leaving a sentence. It feels the hand that hoists it, the tug on the line, the expectant part, the exact moment weight wins. It dreams, perhaps, of other balls in other ports doing the same work with local accents. It does not dream of being a bell or a cannon because it has no wish for volume. Its vocation is visibility and restraint, a theatrical fall with a modest footprint. If you are awake at this point, you may be one of those who prefer the littler shows, toast popping, lid settling, punctual cats. Toward evening, the observatory glows a color that window panes particularly like. The mast becomes a silhouette that even a hasty sketch can manage. The staff goes home, carrying the residue of accuracy in their pockets like mint. The river braids itself with light. Somewhere in the city, clocks that were obedient earlier drift a second or two as if testing boundaries. None of this troubles the hill. Night arrives at its own pace without asking permission, which is always the case and somehow never rude. Tomorrow's fall is already implicit, the way tomorrow's tea already exists in someone's mind as a practical hope. If you wanted a moral, the ball does not provide one. It is not a speech, it is a mechanism. Still, a person standing at the fence can decide that a single reliable act can anchor a busy day. A baker's dough will rise whether or not the ball drops, but it is comforting to have formal sanctions for pulling loaves at exactly 1:13. A letter can be posted at any hour, but there is a quiet thrill to sealing it in the steady minute after the drop, as if you and the globe have just shaken hands and agreed on facts. And sailors who live in a world where facts and waves negotiate constantly have always liked a ceremony that tells the sea politely that arithmetic is in charge. By now your breathing may have joined the big metronome that days become when we allow them to. The red sphere sits again at rest. The mass keeps a place for tomorrow's sentence to end. The park is not waiting. It is practicing patience reflexively, the way lungs practice air. You can fall asleep knowing that somewhere a keeper will lift the strap, check the needle, glance at the sky, and prepare the quietest public event in London. At 1, a little weight will become a little motion, and a city full of bread, letters, cranes, cats, and clocks will nod together in that understated, universal language. Now, you might not expect a missing grave to act like a compass, but the rumor of Alexander's tomb has been politely pointing people around the Mediterranean for 2,000 years. It points them to glass that isn't there, to streets that folded, to a gate where nobody keeps the key anymore. A conqueror vanished not into mist, but into paperwork, which is the quieter sort of disappearance. If you're still awake in a few minutes, feel free to subscribe for more mysteries that resolve into comfortable shrugs. But honestly, don't reach for any buttons. This is a story about walking slowly, reading old labels, and setting a lantern down because the dust looks interesting. Low lamps reveal a cortege leaving Babylon with a body sealed in honey, which is a sentence that makes historians nod because honey is the ancient world's version of "we'll take no chances." The funeral wants to go to Macedon, as if homesickness applies to kings who never stayed home. But Ptolemy, who is good at maps and opportunities, suggests Egypt with the gentle firmness of a person steering a very large sofa through a narrow door. The procession shifts direction, and somewhere a scribe has to cross out a line and write a new one, which is probably the most human moment in the whole adventure. Memphis receives the body first, a practical stop, a political stop, a stop that smells like incense and administrative ink. Priests walk in a careful rectangle. Dancers forget to be solemn only for the length of a smile. If you listen closely, you can almost hear a mule consider history and decide it's mostly about balance. From Memphis, the road turns toward the new city at the river's edge, the city that will eventually name itself loudly Alexandria. A sanctuary rises later called the Summa, which is Greek for the body, a name that is both poetic and uncreative, like calling a lighthouse. The light. The first coffin is gold, and then, according to visitors with reasonable eyesight, swapped for crystal as if transparency were a royal virtue. People file past, sand still clinging to sandals, and try on their indoor voices. The shrine's lamps make a sort of golden whisper around the sarcophagus. Outside, a street plan flexes like a hand learning a habit. A grave becomes landmark, then habit, then direction left at the body, guides say, and nobody finds it strange. Markets unfurl beside it. Bakers learn that bread rises at the same speed whether a king sleeps nearby or not, which is reassuring. A boy selling figs guesses the number of soldiers who step in with helmets under their arms and wins his own game most afternoons. One imagines a maintenance note somewhere, crystal wiped on festival days, gold wiped always. Emperors begin to arrive like serious tourists. Julius Caesar steps in briefly during chaos and forgets to be impressed, only because he is already full of himself that week. Augustus comes later with that tidy mind of his, plucks a flower carefully casual and leaves it like a footnote. Caracalla appears, armored in emotion, and orders ceremonies that sound like a rehearsal for a different life. Septimius Severus, who adored libraries, reportedly sealed the inner rooms as if the problem with memory were that it had too many doors. Each imperial visit writes a line, none writes the ending. The guards treat the place as both temple and archive, strict but not cold, sandals wiped, voices lowered, questions answered in the tone you use when pointing out a cat that is asleep, and should remain so. Guides learn to gesture with their whole hand rather than a finger. Left at the colonnade, right at the king. Past the statue with the nose, mind the step. 1,000 feet memorize the route better than any map, which is how cities like to remember things, by walking them until the path becomes grammar. Around the shrine, ordinary life nudges history without quite knocking it over. Women carry water past the door and pretend not to notice senators practicing reverence. A man offers to sell you a small clay Alexander with a suspiciously modern chin and a guarantee that it brings good fortune if dusted weekly. Children count the number of pillars they can run around before their guardians catch them, which turns out to be fewer than expected when a priest coughs. A poet stands outside and writes a brief, respectable line that rhymes glory with story, proving that some cliches are older than amphory. The harbor smells like tar and salt and other practicalities. The wind thinks about being helpful and often chooses charm instead. All of it hums around the glass box where the city keeps a personality it borrowed from a man who preferred moving to being kept. Somewhere in the distance, a coppersmith hammers, and the sound explains the Roman Empire better than any speech. Then the long, slow business of displacement begins, the kind that doesn't look like a plot because it never hurries. Earthquakes arrive on the schedule nobody sees. The sea lifts its shoulder and drops warehouses. Fires take shortcuts the way fires do. Streets are repaved, which is both civic pride and an excellent way to hide anything you're not using at the moment. Laws change their minds. Edicts reorganize reverence. Saints raise their hands in new places, and old princes make room. A chapel borrows a corner, a wall shifts. A doorway becomes a wall. Silence does the last work that hammers cannot. In notebooks, phrases like, as it was said, multiply like polite weeds. The shrine retains its breath for a while. Markets still pause when processions pass, but the city's attention, which is a kitten chasing many strings, finds newer threads. By the time we reach centuries that prefer parchment, the certainty has gone cloudy with the sort of confidence that begins sentences with surely. Writers keep leaving breadcrumbs that are both helpful and not. A Venetian sketches a sealed chamber and then draws a fish with the same pencil, which raises archival questions. An Arab chronicler notes marble steps leading to a place where the air feels busy, which is either piety or geology. A pilgrim mentions bones in polite plural and a rumor about the prophet Daniel, because Alexandria collects stories the way beaches collect glass rounded, pretty and rarely from the original bottle. Each clue sounds clear until it meets the next one, and they become cloudy together, like tea with a generous pour of milk. Meanwhile, the city keeps paving, unpaving, renaming, and building new corners for its weather to argue with. The harbor sends daggers of light into alleys where cartwheels turn history into tidy lines. If the king is moved from one room to another, it is done carefully, under hands that have practiced lifting with the knees, the way movers everywhere whisper to cargo as if compliments reduced weight. Centuries roll by politely, as centuries often do when they are not being asked to perform. The crusaders arrive and write in a handwriting you can hear. Mamluks adjust the skyline. A sultan plans, an engineer measures, a clerk sharpens a reed. The shrine may have become a memory written over by new memories, the way a palimpsest keeps secrets not because it is sly, but because parchment is expensive. People keep asking where the body is, and the city, who is the real main character here, keeps answering by pointing in 3 directions at once. What disappears in a port rarely sails far. It usually settles under a new floor and grows very invested in modesty. By now, any remaining glass is bone dry and fortunate to be unbroken. Any remaining label finds itself married to a new meaning through the ceremony everyday use. A former sacred hallway becomes an excellent place to lean while the bread cools. The disappearance is complete not with a flourish, but with a shrug conducted across generations. Modernity, which keeps notebooks with squared paper, arrives with tape measures, trowels, and very tidy optimism. Scholars unfold copies of ancient plans and lay transparent sheets over them like weather maps. The old quarter once called the Brachyon is triangulated from shards, wells, and drains. If Rome left coins, the ground will say so. If Ptolemy left masonry, it will brag in limestone. In a garden called Shalalat, the soil offers blocks aligned to no modern street, which is the archaeologist's version of a flirtation. Out west, at Pabasiris Magna, a temple whispers a rival story from broken rooms and tunnels that remember more footsteps than names. Trench diaries fill with sentences like layer of compact debris, odor faintly marine, which is the kind of poetry you get when you hire careful people. Maps sprout little dots. The dots acquire dates. The dates learn to be humble because dates in old cities prefer approximation. The hut under the streets is not an action sequence. It is a patient conversation with gravel. There are sieves, brushes, and the glamorous act of labeling bags. Pottery sherds introduce themselves as parts of bowls that once knew soup. Plaster fragments recall ceilings that used to glare at guests. A battered headless statue is catalogued with the same courtesy as a perfect bead, because both have survived in their own ways. A drain that nobody loved turns out to be an excellent historian. An alley reveals it used to be elsewhere. Scholars compare a traveler's paragraph to a trench profile and discover that adjectives age poorly. Micro hooks appear on ordinary afternoons. A small piece of alabaster polished to a window's softness. A nail bent when someone made a mistake and didn't admit it. A fingertip's worth of gold leaf that stuck to a crack and then to time. None of these objects is a king, but together they make a plausible room in which a king might once have been polite. If the tomb moved once, perhaps it moved twice, under careful hands that preferred lifting to arguing. Reburial was a normal courtesy for crowded cities, a municipal way of saying, we remember. We also need the room. You could stitch together a chain of respectful relocations, from the first sanctuary to a safer hall, from that hall to a noble crypt, from the crypt to a place kept intentionally quiet, from quiet to the kind of absence that is almost a form of presence. The last position may be absence itself, which is not nothing but a well-managed something, an idea protected by uncertainty. An empty space can behave like a monument if enough people walk around it carefully. And so a bedtime hypothesis forms, not with trumpets, but with a librarian's voice. The mausoleum that moved cities moved within its city until movement became its last location. The map closes softly. Notes are filed. Dust settles back into the patient layers where it has always done its best thinking. Somewhere in Alexandria, a child learns the way to a bakery by turning left where an older person gestures. And the gesture remembers a shrine that remembers a conqueror who liked to be in motion. We end, not with a discovery, but with a city listening back to questions with the kind of silence that is almost an answer. If you feel your eyes heavy now, that is appropriate. This mystery has been tucking itself in for centuries, sleeping under streets that forget and remember on the same day. Tomorrow another trench will be opened, another drain will teach humility, and a small piece of marble will admit it used to have neighbors. For tonight, it is enough to know that somewhere a conqueror is still walking the map line by patient line, while the rest of us drift, respectfully, into the gentlest kind of not knowing. You might not expect a piece of metal the length of a child, S-armed to have opinions about the shape of the planet, but for a long, drowsy century, the world asked a single bar to decide how far we all stood from one another. Not a sword, not a wand, just a calmly polished strip tucked in a velvet-lined box. Its job was to be there, precisely there, and to do nothing with magnificent consistency. If, in a few minutes, you re somehow still awake and enjoying the gentle problem of how to keep a meter from getting longer on hot days, feel free to subscribe. But truly, don't string your thumb. Rest it. We're measuring tonight at the speed of dust. The dream of a sensible length began with a walk. Two men, Delbert and McCain, took careful, many-year walks up and down the meridian from Dunkirk to Barcelona, cursing hills and clouds and the persuasive ambition of the French Revolution. They carried circles so precise that the circles had personalities and chains that were always almost straight. They measured angles between stars and church towers, added triangles to triangles, and learned the texture of wind in their teeth. In inns, they filled notebooks with tiny numbers and larger coffee stains. Villagers watched them set up instruments in fields and concluded, with the rural logic of the 1790s, that the strangers were either astronomers or a mild problem. The idea was admirably simple and exhaustingly literal. Define the meter as 1/10,000,000th of the distance from the equator to the North Pole along a meridian. Then build it as a bar so ordinary carpenters could copy it without holding a sextant, somewhere between Barcelona's white glare and Dunkirk's polite rain. The scholars discovered that the Earth is less of a sphere and more of a shrug. Close enough, said the committees. The meter would be better than feet, which had a habit of belonging to kings. The first bar, made of platinum because the Enlightenment liked to pick elements that sounded like a sigh, did its best to embody a quarter of a quadrant's arithmetic. People admired it for being aggressively average in a heroic way. Later, a platinum iridium bar took over because alloy improves patience. Artisans at Severus filed and burnished until the bar's ends were less important than 2 lines etched on its belly. Those lines, just scratches, really were the whole universe for surveyors who wanted to measure a bridge into existence without inviting arguments. The bar lay in a vault under 3 keys and a glass conscience. Officials opened the box with the slow ceremony of a sleeping cat stretching, then lifted the bar with gloves as if oils from fingers would lengthen nations. Nearby, a thermometer refused to look away. The bar was legal only at 0 degrees Celsius, which is a very reasonable temperature for ice and a very unreasonable temperature for offices. When the air warmed, the bar grew longer by a whisper, and the whisper had to be accounted for in ledgers that carried more decimals than optimism. Somewhere in the vault, a caretaker's pencil dulled evenly as the century wore on. Replicas, nearly perfect twins, were sent to national laboratories with customs paperwork that must have felt philosophical. Imagine declaring in triplicate that a nation now possessed exactly 1 meter. As compared, the bars traveled in padded crates that looked like they belonged to a well-loved flute. In Berlin and London and Rio de Janeiro, comparators' long benches with delicate jaws kissed lines to lines and recorded disagreements slenderer than a human hair. The resulting numbers lived in blue-backed reports that explained, with great serenity, how a bar could be the same as itself, yet not quite the same as its neighbors. The meter became a community of nearly identical objects, like respectable cousins arriving at a wedding with the same tie and slightly different opinions about soup. Carpentry books added helpful tables. The difference between an iron meter at noon in summer and a wooden one made in a cheerful hurry. Toolmakers discovered that someone would indeed read footnotes about humidity. There were rituals. In Severus, a committee met to compare the national bars to the international, one under a polite cloud of breath on winter mornings. The doors made the same sound, the table made the same small complaint, the gloves fit hands that had previously been other people's hands. A man with calm handwriting wrote, "No observable change," so often that his hand learned the phrase by muscle memory and used it later in letters to friends. Students were taught to imagine the meter like a parish priest, local, reliable, and invested in baptizing planks. Make it a meter, a foreman said, and the apprentice reached for the rule with a little brass cap on one end, the one that clacked against oak like a gentleman clearing his throat. In Paris, a few meter stones were set into city walls for public admiration. People measured shawls against them and felt modern in the way that makes tea taste slightly different. The bar itself led a contemplative life. It slept in its box like a good dog, woke for anniversaries, and listened with interest to the sound of its own crate latches. It was polished rarely and only with something soft, the way you polish memory. Condensation was a holiday. The thermometer insisted on being in the photograph, and it usually was. The velvet lining kept its color, even after the news changed government several times. At odd moments, a visitor would say, with a little thrill, "There it is," as if catching a glimpse of a celebrity who preferred not to stand up. In that era, you could say, without irony, "The meter is doing fine," and at least two people would nod because that was the meeting's agenda. Still, precision is a fidgety companion. Micrometers learn new tricks, comparators learn new commas, and the bar's habit of expanding when warm became the scientific version of a cardigan, a manageable inconvenience that still makes one sigh. Laboratories sprouted interferometers, mirrors, and light and stripes that shivered when a length changed by less than a red blood cell. A line on the bar, once a respectable standard, found itself blinking in the bright company of light waves and electric clocks. Meanwhile, the world that had agreed on a meter disagreed loudly and forever about how far a meter's economic influence should reach. Train tracks were laid in lengths that multiplied politely into kilometers. Tailors slid chalk along cloth, confident that a meter of wool in Lisbon would match a meter of wool in Mayan. On building sites, someone always used a tape measure that had met paint, rain, concrete, and a nail as if they were relatives. Yet when parts made in one country refused to fit parts made in another by a sliver you could argue with, everyone looked back across oceans, across ledgers toward the quiet bar in the vault and whispered, just to be safe, "Are you quite sure?" It nodded in the way bars nod. Then came the decade of orange light. In 1960, the meter was reimagined by radiation from Krypton 86, a sunset-colored promise with a high opinion of repetition. Instead of two engraved lines, we were given a certain number of wavelengths, stacked like polite plates. It sounded extravagant, like introducing a singer to replace a librarian, except the singer never once missed a note. Laboratories lit narrow rooms with obedient orange, counted fringes, and reported to each other with the relieved tone of people who had finally convinced time to sit still. The old bar did not retire with drama. It remained in the vault like a former head of department who still had keys and an excellent memory for where the good rulers were kept. And then, with a modest flourish disguised as a definition, the meter stopped being a thing and became an agreement with the speed of light. Out in the world, nothing looked different. On workbenches, tape measures still sprang back with the same sharp reprimand. Chalk lines snapped with a tiny cloud and made their confident blue claims. Printers argued with margins. Stage crews shouted half metrics to each other with more urgency than the speed of light has yet demonstrated. The meter, redefined, remained exactly as long as kitchen islands required. Only in the vaults did the air change a little less theatrical reverence, more regular housekeeping. The international prototype, the great bar of the age of velvet, acquired the aura of an heirloom placed carefully behind glass, loved, but not asked to pay the bills. The old bars did not sulk. Many found second careers as museum objects that teach patience. Children peer in at Severs and hear about frost in gloves and tiny expansions. They nod and forget. Then, years later, they measure a window and recall, faintly, that metal grows in heat the way bread does. Some bars remain in national labs, companions to interferometers that still appreciate a physical friend. On anniversaries, someone writes an article with photographs of the vault and a paragraph about how the locks made of mythology are, in fact, quite ordinary. There's no scandal in the story, just the benevolent creep of better. The bar did its work. It went to meetings for a century. It kept bridges honest, inches at bay, and engineers employed. These days, a metrologist, an excellent word to say just before sleep, builds a meter by timing light with a clock that listens to atoms quiver. The clock sits in a room that looks like a tidy spaceship made by a careful uncle. It prefers not to be breathed on. Fibers carry light with the jury-duty seriousness of fibers everywhere. Software counts. If something warms up, it is an event with a graph. The bar in the museum watches this modern ballet with the gentle pride of a retired conductor, still able to hum the oboe line. When visitors ask whether the old meter was wrong, the curator smiles and says that wrongness is not the relevant dimension. The bar was as good as it could be, and the world it served knew how to be patient. All this sounds grand, but most mirrors live quieter lives. A store clerk measures fabric and folds it in a stack that will nap until chosen. A gardener eyes a patch of ground and decides it is 2 meters by 3, which is either true or honest, both useful. A road crew sets cones 3 meters apart and later tells a story about a seagull who stole a sandwich. A swimmer touches the wall and reads numbers whose painted neatness surrenders to water. A carpenter who prefers millimeters builds a bookshelf that persuades paperbacks to stand at attention. In apartments where the tape measure is in a drawer that also contains string, screws, and a key to a lock that no longer exists, the meter is measured by handspans, cigarettes, or steps, and remains quietly a kindness. If you ever handle an old wooden rule, you can still meet its ghosts. The brassware on the end where someone knocked it against a thorny 1930s nail. The faint scorch from a time the owner measured while smoking. The initials carved in small defiance on the back. You can close your eyes and hear the soft click as it folds, a sound that makes the past look up and nod. Somewhere a machinist wipes a micrometer with a rag that could tell stories if allowed. Somewhere a violin maker's bench accepts a pencil line exactly 330 millimeters from a known edge. Somewhere a surveyor leans his staff against a fence and eats a sandwich while the total station waits like a well-trained dog. We return briefly to the vault, because the vault returns to us whether we ask it to or not. The international prototype meter lies in its case silver white, a little smug, uncomplaining. The felt lining is replaced from time to time with the same shade, because tradition is, among other things, a color. The temperature is reported in a neat hand. Every so often, as a kindness to history, the bar is lifted and checked and told that it has changed by nothing anyone wishes to quarrel about. The ceremonial screwdriver is returned to its drawer. The door is closed with the remembered weight of doors. Outside, buses guess their own meters between stops with gentle inaccuracy, which seems like art. Definitions have drifted upward from the shelf into the language of light, but the human habit of laying a rule along a thing endures. No one has ever hung a picture frame with a laser alone. It takes a thumb, a breath, and a step back. Engineers still put numbers in boxes and circle them, as if the circles keep the numbers from escaping. Artists still tape the floor in meters and have them, then have them again until a dancer knows where to stop. The meter's intelligence now lives in machines that gleam and hum, yet its friendliness continues in the daily clack of tapes, the friendly snap of chalk, the steady comfort of a meter and a bit. If you're awake, notice the quiet ambition in all this. A species that wished to count the world to a single length and largely succeeded by walking, filing, warming, cooling, arguing, and then agreeing anyway. The meter became a bar, then a color, then a speed. We kept building shelves. Somewhere in a late-night lab, a scientist watches an interference fringe hold its line like a cat holding his stare. Somewhere in a field, a tape measure reels back into its case with a satisfied sigh. We finish as we began, with a strip of metal resting, no heroics. Just a standard that did what standards do, stood. The vault is dark again, except for a small green light that approves of itself. Dust settles evenly, which is all dust ever asks. And the world, arranged in reasonable increments, breathes. You can feel the rhythm of it if you listen. A meter, another still, each the same length as the space your thoughts take when they lengthen and fade, slow and softer, until even light forgets for a blink that it was supposed to hurry. You might not expect a marble tomb to be good at moving. The way a tortoise is not famous for sprinting, and yet here we are, led by a rumor in sandals that says the resting place of Alexander the Great learned to drift the way cities do slowly, by habit and paperwork. If you're still awake by the time we reach the part where a Venetian sketches a rectangle that might be a door, feel free to subscribe, or don't. I will assume you did and be just as pleased either way. For now, we begin in faint light, where carts rattle, priests whisper numbers, and a body sealed with honey is arguing with geography about which road is most respectful. The first leg of the journey does not feel like a journey at all, more like an administrative transfer with a very famous passenger. Alexander dies in Babylon, which is hot enough to teach even legends to be practical. Honey and resin do what they always do: preserve, pretend, and smell faintly of kitchens. The cortege waits for a decision. It is told to head toward Macedon, then, with the calm decisiveness of a man changing trains, Ptolemy removes the funeral from the timetable and gently reroutes it toward Egypt. If you can redirect the conqueror of the Persian Empire the way one might redirect a parcel, you are probably ready to found a dynasty. They turn southwest. Memphis receives him first, not because prophets dreamed it, but because Memphis had a functioning quay and respectable storage. If you're wondering whether the map noticed, it did. Roadside shrines adjusted their angles. The distance between two cities quietly learned a new meaning, and a caravan of professional mourners discovered that grief is easier when the path is flat. Alexandria is very young at this point, new enough to squeak. It has straight streets like unwrinkled paper and a lighthouse that is not yet a metaphor. In the city's bright geometry, a house is built for the body. And the house takes a name so direct it could have been muttered by a porter. The Summa, the body. Visitors tell each other it shines like glass. They behave accordingly, stepping lightly, lowering voices, testing the echo. At first the sarcophagus is gold because the city enjoys being obvious. Later, a clearer crystal rises around the bones because transparency is a form of devotion. The shrine finds its own weather, lamps tended by priests who measure time the way boats count waves. Flowers that remember to wilt even in elegant architecture. A corridor that smells permanently of almonds and dust. Markets reorganize around the Summa the way planets negotiate with a star. A baker discovers that loaves shaped like helmets sell well. A guide learns that if you tell people to turn left at the colonnade and right at the king, they will arrive without thinking. The tomb becomes a habit first, then a landmark, then a direction. In the long parade of emperors who had the common courtesy to visit other people's ancestors, Julius Caesar appears with a historian's curiosity and a conqueror's walk. He peers in during chaos, his specialty, and leaves a remark that reads like a shrug with excellent. Latin, Augustus is more deliberate. He plucks a flower from somewhere humbler than the Mausoleum and places it there, an offering small enough to be read as taste. Later emperors, who rarely missed the chance to practice being seen, arrive with their interpreters of awe. Caracalla brings a cloak because men who carry many titles also carry dress. Others bring taxes, as if a shrine could keep accounts. Some bring rumor, which shrines absorb the way limestone absorbs light. A visitor notes the nose, the chin, the length of the jaw, and believes he is describing destiny rather than bone. A guard who has heard these observations for years closes the lid with the gentle speed of a librarian returning a book nothing is allowed to borrow. Around the Suma, the city breathes. Processions thread in and out like needles through cloth. A long ribbon of feet memorizes the route better than any plan drawn by a magistrate. The harbor smells of tar, salt, and whatever you ate for lunch, in that order. Alexandria's wains pick up the sound of sandals and return it as a collective hush. The shrine is both temple and archive, strict but not cold. Children learn, incorrectly but charmingly, that the walls are so polished they remember faces. Vendors develop a tone reserved specifically for people emerging from reverence. It is a little softer and always mentions dates, both the fruit and the calendar. If you are not from here and you ask directions, an old man gestures with his whole arm, a motion that includes the lighthouse, the library, and the absence of rain, and yet somehow you arrive exactly where you were meant to stand. And then, slowly as a cupboard settling, the tomb begins to disappear. Not at once, not theatrically, and certainly not with a vow. Alexandria has earthquakes in the way that cities on generous faults do. Fires rearrange quarters with the earnestness of overzealous decorators. Each time the city rebuilds itself, it does so a little differently, a street corrected by a degree, a gate named after a new benefactor, a colonnade whose replacement columns aim for the sky from slightly different arguments with gravity. Laws change. Shrines fall out of fashion or back into it. New saints ask for old rooms. A bright sanctuary devoted to a new kind of holiness opens a door where another door used to be. A shrine becomes a chapel, becomes an oratory, becomes a memory, becomes an address someone retained out of habit. Names, which are the most courageous sleepers, roll over. Someone writes the new one on a tablet that used to carry the old one, and the tablet does not object. Asterisk, asterisk historians, being tender to uncertainty, collect clues like buttons. A medieval list describes chapels as if reading the city its own anatomy, careful, exact, and nervously aware that walls migrate. A Venetian diplomat passes through and sketches a sealed chamber with the confidence of a man who loves rectangles. An Arab chronicler mentions steps in marble as casually as one mentions rain on Tuesday. A pilgrim records a church of Saint So-and-so that whispers more loudly than any sermon. Guides tell stories with hand gestures that have outlived their nouns. Each piece is clear alone, cloudy together. The pile of evidence becomes a friendly fog. You know where you are, while also not being sure until someone points at a patch of ground and says, "There," which, in Mediterranean archaeology, is the sound of hope sitting down. The modern hunt begins underfoot rather than in books, not because books lie, but because stones have an intimacy with position that text cannot manage. Scholars triangulate the vanished Breccian Alexandria's royal quarter using fragments of walls, wells that refuse to move, and drains that have opinions about slope. In the Shapi district, garden pits produce masonry aligned to no modern street, as if a previous city were trying to stand up through the grass. An excavation yields a foundation that insists on a rectangle where history wants a circle. A measuring tape clicks back into its case with the same satisfaction as it did for Delembert and McCain. Centuries and countries away, out toward Tapissiris Magna, west along the coast, broken limestone tells a rival story in the dependable grammar of collapsed blocks. Someone draws a plan. The plan resembles another plan drawn a generation earlier by someone who also believed in plans. Instruments beep. The city listens with echoes, not answers. Every few years, a hypothesis is dressed for the evening and invited outside. Perhaps the Soma moved early from the royal quarter to a quieter place inland, out of the way of merchants who counted with enthusiasm. Perhaps the shrine became a small building in a Christian precinct, not as victory or theft, but as the boring mercy of continuity, a roof reused because rain is democratic. Perhaps the body, by then more relic than person, was moved again under careful hands when an edict shook doors off hinges, when a governor decided that piety was best performed in private, or when an earthquake drew a line that citizens responded to with practical boots. That chain of burials could form a path around which the medieval stories tighten like a ribbon. Left at the colonnade, right at the king, becomes past the old bathhouse down to the steps, where the candles don't go out. The last position might be the cleverest of all, absence arranged so completely that it protects itself. This is less mysterious than it sounds. Many things in cities survive by becoming difficult to argue with. Along the way, small absurdities doze in the margins like cats on ledgers. A cartographer copying a medieval map at 2 a.m. adds a dot labeled Mausoleum with the serene confidence of a man who believes in dots. A museum label cautiously deploys the word tradition 3 times in one sentence, which is the philologist's version of whistling. A guidebook describes the general area of veneration and then suggests a cafe with very good sesame biscuits. A trench produces 7 unconnected steps, pretty enough to be convincing to people who wanted stairs in the first place. A business across the street from a promising wall sells light bulbs and compatible hope. At night, a security guard leans on a fence and explains to a student that buildings are like families. Everyone thinks they know who they belong to until the birthday. Party brings out maps. Meanwhile, a protest of practical facts marched along the harbor. Alexandria never stops being a working city. Buses are late the way they are everywhere. The wind forgets its appointment with silence and drags grit across paperwork. A cat patrols a broken cornice as if she owns the late antique period and is auditing it for errors. Children run in alleys that could, if an archivist squinted, be called lanes from the Ptolemaic grid. The hunt folds itself into this daily rhythm until the past and the present look like 2 threads pulled through the same cloth with patience. The city's memory becomes an unhurried conversation you can join if you walk slowly, which is also an excellent way to fall asleep. The best guesses keep returning to the same humane proposition. If the tomb moved, it moved the way ordinary sacred things move quietly, politely, with notes left under candlesticks explaining where key holders should meet next time. It is easy to imagine a line of quarters, respectful in that particular Egyptian way that treats stone as a colleague, carrying a shrine on a day when the heir had agreed to behave. At each stop, someone dusted corners that needed dusting, made a list of incense shortages, and asked a neighbor for a hammer. A scribe wrote a brief notice so neutrally phrased that it could be interpreted in at least 3 centuries, and then the paper went where paper always goes. The older site became a chapel for something else. A mosaic learned a new icon, a niche filled with candles that did not understand politics. Continuity, that sleepy genius, carried the city forward by refusing to panic. Why does this particular absence comfort? Partly because it lets the world be reasonable. Glory does not always ask for trumpets. Important things sometimes survive by pretending to be ordinary. Partly because the hunt is kindly paced. No single trench is expected to give an answer. No single scholar is burdened with resolution. People draw maps, compare them, change their minds without shame, and add them to the stack. The stack becomes a pillow. When the radio, on a winter afternoon, mentions a promising alignment of walls detected under a garden, you can nod and put the kettle on. The tea steeps at the same rate whether the tomb is 8 blocks north or 1 block south. You sip, you turn a page. The lighthouse is long gone, but the idea of it still helps ships find ports. Asterisk if you're still with me. Bless your stubbornly curious heart. You may be wondering whether we have lost something essential by losing exactness. But think for a moment about how cities remember. Nobody keeps the first chair they ever owned, and yet every kitchen manages to sit people. Alexandria has mislaid a door and kept in exchange an entire atmosphere of directions. When a taxi driver says, "near the old place," he points you not at coordinates, but at a whole geology of intention. The tomb, whether under a church, a patch of soil turned twice by gardeners, or a rectangle that a Venetian would still recognize, participates in that geography of the nearly certain. It is at this hour the best kind of bedtime story, one that ends without ending, not because the teller ran out of plot, but because the scene arrived where it always meant to arrive, at a soft halt. There will be more trenches. Someone will stand knee-deep in sand, holding a clipboard against the wind, feeling heroic and mildly ridiculous. Someone will compare pottery with the concentration of a chess player reading a diary. Someone will publish a drawing of a foundation that is sensibly, insistently rectangular while everyone else hopes for something with more syllables. New technologies will listen for walls with radar the way doctors listen for murmurs. Every few years, a headline will announce that the mystery is solved. Every few weeks, a footnote will announce that the headline enjoys optimism. You and I will go on breathing and sleeping and buttering bread, which is not unrelated to archaeology. Both require patience and crumbs. When we close our eyes, it is easy to imagine the tomb exactly where we need it to be at that moment. Under a low church with a floor that makes polite creaks. Under a municipal garden where soil knows a secret. Under a neighborhood that has grown used to living above rumors and paying rent anyway. The guard adjusts his cap. The cat watches nothing and sees everything. Candles, somewhere, flicker at a draft that belongs to the 4th century. Maps fold themselves neatly. The harbor wind lifts a small drift of limestone dust and sets it down again, as if teaching the stone how to sleep. If you're still awake, and how surprising, this is the place to let curiosity loosen its tie. The mausoleum that moves cities has not asked us for a solution, only companionship. We can walk with it a little while, from Babylon's hot air through Memphis's practical welcome into Alexandria's precise light, through centuries that prefer renovations to endings. The lamp by your bed is doing an admirable impression of a lighthouse. Your breathing has become a procession with no destination and better rhythm than most parades. Somewhere a key turns in an old iron gate. Somewhere a crack holds a fleck of gold leaf like a forgotten thought. And somewhere, under a city that knows the value of silence, stone waits without impatience, still and ordinary, continuing to be exactly where it is, even as whole empires drift very gently toward sleep. You might not expect a bright red wooden sphere to be an authority on punctuality, but in the 19th century, a ball the size of an optimistic pumpkin told ships when to set their clocks. And the ships listened like school children at roll call. If you're still awake by the time we get to the telegraph clerk who forgot it was Tuesday and dropped the ball on Wednesday, feel free to subscribe. Or don't. I'll set an imaginary bell to ring if you do, and I promise it will be a very quiet bell. Tonight we are walking slowly along harbor walls and observatory lawns, watching time announce itself by falling, exactly once a day, and then pretending nothing unusual happened. The idea is simple enough to explain to a cat. Every day at a fixed moment, usually noon. Because lunch has always been persuasive, a large ball is hoisted up a mast. Pause near the top so everyone can say, "Ah, there it is," and then let drop. From the deck of a ship riding at anchor, this is better than a clock that may have opinions about humidity. Eyes watch the pause. Hands hover over brass knobs. When the ball falls, an officer notes the second, and the chronometer on board, which is a pocket watch that went to finishing school, is corrected with the kind of ceremony usually reserved for toasts. The distance to longitude is calculated later. For now, there is the pleasant certainty that something large has obeyed gravity on schedule. The first-time balls belong to practical romantics. naval men and observatory keepers who had learned that sailors trusted what they could see, especially if it couldn't be argued with. Wind might lie. A falling sphere seldom does. They tried the experiment in English ports first. The mast at Portsmouth trained everyone's necks upward in the 1820s, a decade that liked straight lines and respectable hats. Greenwich followed with better lawns and an audience of Londoners who were already good at pretending not to stare. By 1833, the Greenwich Ball had acquired a personality, raised slowly at 5 minutes to noon, halted just below the finial to give latecomers a chance, then dropped exactly when the astronomer said so, a theatrical pause that even the tide respected. The ball itself was made of wood and copper sheathing, red so that fog might think twice before hiding it. A caretaker checked it for rainwater with the devotion of a man who had recently learned about rot. Small repairs became a kind of liturgy: new paint in spring, a rope spliced before breakfast, a pulley that needed something soothing like tallow or kind words. On ship decks, men held their breath for 2 seconds because superstition loves precision. Not everywhere had the luxury of standing within eyesight of an observatory, so the signal traveled. Hilltop semaphores tried, flapping arms that could be misread by a nap, but the telegraph made better promises. A wire carried Greenwich noon along rails and riverbanks to coastal masts that dropped their own balls in obedient chorus. Liverpool's dockyards paused in unison. Deal's boatmen checked pockets for pencil stubs. Edinburgh asked its castle gun to speak the time out loud because sometimes a city prefers a noise you can feel in your ribs. The gun was trained to fire 1 second after the ball fell, a compromise so Scottish that it deserves a tartan. On certain windy days, the gun spoke before the echo of yesterday finished, which is also how deadlines work. In New York, an officer on the battery raised and dropped a ball linked to the observatory at Washington. Wall Street nodded, and ships in the Hudson aligned their carefully wound futures. The telegraph added a danger nobody had anticipated. Punctuality at a distance required people who could be relied on not to sneeze at important moments. There are notes in several harbors about drop balls that stubbornly refused to fall, like a toast that forgot the punchline. Once the line shorted in rain and the mast, electrified with intent, hoisted the ball, held it, and made it release with a sulky clunk exactly 94 seconds late. An officer wrote in his log, "Signal unsatisfactory." Cook satisfactory, which tells you more about life than physics. At a colonial port, a time master took sick, and his assistant, who, to be fair, was excellent at supplies, pulled the wrong lever and released a flag instead of the ball. Half the fleet reset their chronometers to a flapping rectangle and then spent the afternoon correcting each other very politely. When commands were sent by cable, the format included a practiced economy: prepare, ready, drop. The ellipses were felt more than heard. Like the breath before a choir enters dot by this point, the daily theater of noon had trained cities to stand a little straighter. Shops learned to begin lunch with something approaching fairness. Railways, those iron optimists, borrowed the discipline and amplified it. Their schedules demanded that all the clocks in a region agree as if they had met beforehand. Station masters became ambassadors between time as experienced and time as written down. The telegraph line from Greenwich became a tree. Off its careful trunk grew branch signals to towns that had never met the sea, so that a watchmaker in Birmingham could nod at the same second as a helmsman in the Downs. Children learned that the ball dropped at 5 minutes after the whistle, or was it 3? A great deal of family punctuality depends on folklore. Newspapers printed Greenwich time as a kind of moral. If you missed it, well, that was a story you told yourself. Mechanical details multiplied with sleepy charm. The mast's hoisting rope had to be a specific thickness, not for strength, but so that the knot sat handsomely in its cup. The ball's interior frame got cross-braced in a pattern that would have pleased shipwrights and geometry teachers. In winter, hoarfrost added a clandestine weight. The keeper kept a broom just for that. A little door was cut in the sphere with hinges that squeaked twice a year like an old uncle. The release shackle had a small spring whose only purpose was to make the fall look decisive. You could, if you were sorry for machinery, feel tender toward such arrangements. All that care so that a heavy thing could briefly be free in public. Some days an observatory catloop. They all had them sat at the base of the mast and did not blink when gravity performed, which is the highest praise available to any human effort. Errors produced their own catalog. Fog played the villain, of course, and there were mornings when an entire harbor agreed that the ball had fallen only when the castle gun said it had. A case of acoustics deciding a visual matter. Heat shimmered on summer days until the sphere looked hesitant. The split second when it let go appeared to arrive twice. A prankster once hired a boy with a red kite to confuse a particularly excitable captain. The captain apologized later to his crew for resetting their lives based on a child, a scenario modern managers know well. Lightning struck a time ball without malice, split its wooden skin, and left it smoking but functional. A carpenter patted it as if it were a horse that had seen something startling. The city wrote minutes about insurance in a tone halfway between concern and bureaucratic coziness. A new ball was ordered at once and shipped with paperwork that described it as of the usual size and gravity, which is the most British line ever, paid for by a treasury. Psychology of the ritual is the warmest part. People like watching for an agreed moment because it asks so little and delivers exactly that. On ships, the navigator stood with a small book and a face that had practiced seriousness. He would say, "Now," and 3 or 4 men would make the same small motion at the same time, a turning of the crown, a tidy note, a glance at the sky to see whether the sky noticed. When you read their logs, the sentences about noon carry a human temperature different from wind and barometer. They are tidy, relieved, almost domestic. Cron, set by ball, very good biscuits, acceptable. In town squares, someone would always pretend not to care, and then confess he had looked at the exact instant because otherwise life felt slippery. A child asked her mother whether the ball got tired. The mother said yes, and changed nothing about bedtime. Beyond ports, time signals diversified like polite cousins. Some cities preferred a cannon at 1 because printers like to eat lunch at 12, and compromise is the engine of civilization. In Paris, a tiny ball fell inside a glass case on the Rue de Rivoli, so that strollers with good hats could agree with science without looking away from fashion. In Glasgow, a clock sent an electric pulse to a bell that sounded too modest to be official, and yet trains obeyed it. Lighthouses, already in the business of certainty, took to dropping balls from gallery rails for nearby fishermen who timed their nets to tides and arguments. Even without seeing the sphere, people learned the choreography. The pause lifted anticipation like a conductor's baton. The drop released it. You could set stew by it. You could sorrow by it, if needed. You could decide on a nap with evidence, across oceans, ports improvised. Cape Town painted its ball white because local light is mischievous. Sydney gave theirs a little lightning rod and a reputation for cheerful efficiency. Boston mounted one on a dome building so that the event resembled a porpoise surfacing exactly once a day. Honolulu, practical even in paradise, connected the whole arrangement to a telegraph relay that sometimes preferred beach weather. A keeper learned to bring shade for the instrument as if it were a fussy relative. In Bombay, a heat wave swelled the woods so aggressively that the ball refused to fit its cradle. Carpenters planed it while arguing softly about cricket. A photograph from Buenos Aires captures a solid ring of hats at the dock, all tilted up, the unified tilt of a city believing together for 3 seconds. If belief can be measured in necks, those were very devout afternoons. For all its spread, the technology remained charmingly low. A boy in a flat cap could understand it. A governor could understand it and not be tempted to improve it. What changed everything was the radio signal that did not fall, did not care about weather, and did not take up much space. The first wireless time ticks arrived in headphones as polite little pips, like a mouse tying its shoes. Ships began listening to electricity instead of gravity. Observatory keepers, who had always enjoyed ropes, learned to enjoy valves and vacuum tubes with the affection of men discovering modernity slowly. Time balls kept working. There is always a captain who likes to see the thing happen, but they began to feel like ceremonies. Even the errors became endearing rather than dangerous. The drop could slip a second, and the world would not. A telegrapher smiled in relief at having less to apologize for. Still, places kept their mast and their sphere because cities, like people, save souvenirs from periods when they learned something useful. In Edinburgh, the gun still speaks. In Greenwich, the ball still rises. In Cape Town, tourists applaud every noon as if the act is athletic. A retired navigator visiting with grandchildren says, very casually, we used to, in the tone of a man remembering an old friend who still writes occasionally. On some stormy days, the ball doesn't climb, whether from wind or caution, and the absence is as eloquent as the drop. We know exactly what we have not seen. The harbor keeps its own time on those afternoons. As harbors did before anybody thought to quantify their patience, there is a miniature in all this. I like a watchmaker standing in a narrow shop, listening through the open door for a cannon or watching through a pane for a falling ball, then taking a screwdriver scarcely thicker than a hair to nudge a wheel by less than a thought. The city passes horses first, then bicycles, then early motor cars sounding like determined kettles, and the watchmaker makes the tiniest change. He returns the case to a customer with a nod that says, "You will be where you intend to be." 100,000 of those nods made the 19th century bearable. Trains left, dinners cooled, telegrams arrived, babies slept whenever they felt like it, and still the ball fell. We have, of course, made time portable and private since then. Phones tell us it is noon and 40 fonts. Satellites whisper to quartz and never ask whether it's foggy. Yet the old choreography hasn't lost its calming logic. A visible signal that everybody can see at once contains, even now, a social kindness. It is agreeable to share a second with strangers. Standing on a lawn as the bright sphere hesitates, you can feel the day gather itself. When it drops, a small consent passes through the watching crowd. Yes, this now. People smile for no reason that would impress a philosopher. A child claps and doesn't know why. The cat continues to be unimpressed, but that is her role. We have, of course, made time portable and private since then. Phones tell us it is noon and 40 fonts. Satellites whisper to quartz and never ask whether it's foggy. Yet the old choreography hasn't lost its calming logic. A visible signal that everybody can see at once contains, even now, a social kindness. It is agreeable to share a second with strangers. Standing on a lawn as the bright sphere hesitates, you can feel the day gather itself. When it drops, a small consent passes through the watching crowd. Yes, this now. People smile for no reason that would impress a philosopher. A child claps and doesn't know why. The cat continues to be unimpressed, but that is her role. If you are still awake, well done. Truly consider how harmlessly eccentric the whole invention is. No tribunal forced it into existence. No legend crowned it. A few practical minds took their lunch break seriously and decided to give gravity a job with a simple description and excellent benefits. Long before networks and pips, a harbor's accuracy hung from a rope, and it worked because the rope was good and the keeper remembered to wind. There are worse ways to organize a world. I sometimes think the entire 19th century was a vast experiment, and politely agreeing about when to start soup. Some Night's the last ship in the anchorage sets its chronometer with the caution of a man putting a child to bed. The sky underneath has stopped pretending to be blue and is now colorless in a dignified way. Far inland, a clerk files a report that includes the phrase "noon observed," and then invents an errand to stretch his legs. A train in the next valley is already 5 minutes late, but it will make up the difference by being admirable. On the observatory lawn, a keeper checks the rope with fingers that have known a lifetime of knots. He raises the ball. People look up together without consultation. Time takes a breath. For 1 second, noon is a visible thing falling through a bare pattern of air, and then it is ordinary again, which is where most of us prefer it. If a subscription drifted your way during that pause, thank you. If not, I'm still here, counting softly with the harbor, listening for pips nobody else notices, and letting the day go by on schedule so gentle it might as well be sleep. You might not expect a rectangle to have opinions, but paper very quietly does. It prefers to be folded in half in such a way that it still looks like itself, which is an ambition many of us share but rarely achieve. If you're still awake in a few minutes, you can subscribe for more episodes about rectangles with feelings, though there is no pressure. This is a low-stakes conversation with stationery. Tonight we drift through the history of paper sizes, a topic so serene it once put an entire committee to sleep, which is precisely its charm. We will watch the sheets grow, shrink, and multiply like well-mannered rabbits, and we will do it slowly, because haste wrinkles corners. The earliest pieces were not sizes so much as suggestions. Scribes took rag paper from vats and pressed it into frames called molds. Whatever the frame was, that was the size. Europe liked names rather than numbers. Royal foolscap, pot, crown, demi each title sounded like a character from a polite play. A sheet called post was used for letters because coincidence is efficient. No one agreed how big any of them should be. Printers talked in folds instead. You took a big sheet and folded it once to make folio, twice to make quarto, again to make octavo, and so on until the page felt like a whisper. The fold determined the book's personality. Folios were for laws and beliefs that did not wish to be hurried. Octavos were for stories to read in a chair that liked you. A printer in Venice in the 16th century could ask for a handsome small quarto, and everyone nodded as if numbers were a bit vulgar. The result, libraries that looked beautiful, and shipping clerks who sighed. Folding created psalms that could slip into sleeves, and legal codes that could hold open doors. It also created mismatches because the parent sheets varied by mill and river. A crown from one town could be an argumentative cousin to the crown from another. When a binder ordered paper for a series, the 15th and 16th quires might arrive just a whisper narrower, producing a gentle staircase along the foredge. The binder called it character. The customer called it fine. The shelf called it crooked. Meanwhile, in offices, a soldier of bureaucracy called the docket copy marched on foolscap. A tallish sheet with a jester's hat watermark, which felt like a private joke. An English clerk could fold foolscap into thirds with a muscle memory born from sandwiches. The French, not to be outdone, invented formats named Jesus, Soleil, and Colombi, as if the paper itself had a liturgical calendar. Somewhere a pigeon did not mind. A different idea arrived with a rational haircut. In 1786, the physicist Georg Christoph Lichtenberg wrote a calm letter about rectangles whose ratio is the square root of 2. If you cut such a rectangle in half, the halves keep the exact same shape. This is mathematically tidy and psychologically soothing, like seeing your reflection continue after you close the mirror. Paper made to that ratio can be folded, trimmed, and scaled in a way that keeps its personality intact. Lichtenberg was the kind of person who could have invented good slowness. His suggestion waited while the world enjoyed wars and cabinets. During the French Revolution, A committee tried metric papers names like Grand Eagle sound heroic, but after some years the heroism wandered off. Bureaucracies are long conversations. Some ideas paused for a century to sip ink. Germany woke the ratio. In 1922, a standard called DIN 476 declared a family of sizes AO, A1, A2, and so on, each half the previous, all preserving that calm square root 2 shape. OO is big enough to pretend to be a map. If you cut it in half, you got A1. Cut again A2. Repeat until you arrive at a 7, a piece so small it could host a very shy note. The area of AO was defined as 1 square meter, so the arithmetic felt dependable. Printers felt relief the way shoes feel laces. Envelopes were named to match. A C4 envelope welcomed and a 4-sheet unfolded. AC5 smiled at an F4 folded once. Someone somewhere purchased a label maker in celebration. Offices adopted a 210 by 297 millimeters, a number pair so modest that almost bows when spoken aloud. The result was the pleasant habit of a single ream suiting most purposes, letters, reports, and the occasional paper airplane built by a responsible person on break. Across the Atlantic, a parallel story behaved like a cousin who arrived late and brought snacks. The American letter size, 8.5 by 11 inches, became the land's default after a century of gradual habits. The inches were not a mystery so much as an inheritance from molds and typewriters. A broadsheet that fit the hand-cranked platen became standard because hands were cheaper to replace than standards. There were attempts to convert. In the 1970s, a U.S. committee proposed the A series with enthusiasm. The proposal was filed in a cabinet exactly the size of the paper it failed to replace. The result today is a charming incompatibility. Documents travel internationally, like tourists who packed almost the right adapter. A4 is a hair taller and a touch narrower than letter. Photocopiers that meet both must have internal diplomacy. American files prefer width. European binders prefer height. Everyone prefers naps. Scaling came next, and with it a small miracle of convenience. Photocopiers and printers learned to enlarge from a 4 to a 3, or reduce from a 3 to a 4 with no distortion. That is the special gift of the square root 2 ratio. A page can change its mind without losing its accent. Architects took advantage. A plan at 1 to 100 on a 1 could become 1 to 200 on a 3 and remain socially acceptable. Teachers discovered that a worksheet designed on a 4 could bloom into a poster on a 3 without any moral complications. The world agreed to pretend this was ordinary. In truth, it is a tiny applied poem. Fold, halve, repeat, and the rhythm holds. Meanwhile, hole punches became splendidly repetitive. The European 2-hole system placed its circles neatly along a standard called ISO 838. The 4-hole variation added harmony. In North America, the 3-hole punch triumphed with an ergonomic sincerity that made loose-leaf paper feel like a promise. The holes themselves developed personalities. One refused to empty its little crescent moons. Another, the dust-mounted kind, demanded both hands and attention, like a dignified pet. Filing cabinets grew according to what they swallowed. Vertical files in the United States liked letter. Lateral files in Europe smiled at a 4. Drawer depths learn numbers the way feet learn stairs. A cabinet drawer will, if uninspected, drift toward a state called miscellaneous. A geological formation sedimented by meeting notes and warranties for appliances that now live happier elsewhere. Folders came in manila, a color invented to hide dust and regrets. Tabs whispered across a drawer like shy flags. An office clerk in 1953 could, without irony, take pride in a well-alphabetized archive and a pencil sharpened to legislation. A secret of chairs. They judge us by the way we sit to file. When the world later scanned everything into clouds, the chairs had to find new hobbies. Paper sizes wandered into rituals of daily life. The standard passport in many countries fits a 7, handy for pockets that miss the past. Most paperback novels, especially the modest ones, live near A proportions even when the label says B series, which is like wearing a hat with someone else's initials. Many prefer 4 when they wish to look honest and spendy when they wish to perform. Meeting agendas arrive on a 4 everywhere except where they arrive on Mutter, and in both cases they share an afterlife as origami cranes, grocery lists, or coasters protecting tables from ambitious mugs. Posters shout from A.O. walls or whisper from a 3 notice boards. There is an entire economy of clipboards sized to love a particular sheet. A lifeguard holds a 4 with authority. A lab technician holds a 5 with specialized tenderness. A cafe server carries a 6 with a pencil that will escape somewhere near the milk. The B series, often overlooked, lives gently between the A-SB. O sits between AO and something bigger. B5 hugs the space between A5 and A4. Printers use B sizes for books because they are the diplomatic middle. If a paper is the road, B paper is the shoulder where you can pull over to admire scenery. There is also a C series for envelopes fitting a letter the way a sweater fits a patient dog. A C6 envelope hosts an A4 folded twice because even paper enjoys modest gymnastics. Machine designers savored this predictability. A folding unit could be tuned for 1, 2, or Z, and a million letters would sigh in agreement. Somewhere a postal clerk tapped a stack on the counter, so the edges align with the sound of civic virtue. Historians of stationery collect anecdotes that fall asleep kindly on the page. A Swedish office in 1978 weighed employees' memos for a month to calculate toner budgets. The average letter used 4.3 grams of ink because exclamation points were discouraged. A Japanese paper mill cut a 4, sheets to tolerances so fine that a ream could be a millimeter taller or shorter and still receive a polite apology. A British town council standardized its notice boards to 3, then discovered that no one owned A3 printers. Solutions included magnifying glass loans and an employee named Carol with a gift for small handwriting. In a factory, technicians once tested a guillotine cutter by slicing a stack of sacrificial sheets and then measuring the error at the corners. Satisfied, they made a small banner that read, "Accuracy to life," which is a mission statement any of us could adopt on a good day. Dot numbers have their lullaby here. AO is 841 by 1189 millimeters. Cut it and you receive a 1 at 594 by 841. Cut again and a 2 at 420 by 594. Then a 3. Then a 4, the star desks everywhere. The millimeters matter because documents that move through the world like quiet birds need consistent wings. You can feel the arithmetic if you hold a stack and fan it. Each smaller sheet is a half-remembered song of the previous one. The edges line up with the optimism of citizens queuing for bread. Printers' marks, the tiny crosshairs and color bars in a margin, are treasure maps for people who like machines. Cutting guides arrive as faint hairlines, no sensible reader notices. A good trim leaves almost nothing to discuss, which is the best review a binder can hope for, and yet there are domestic rebellions. Children cut paper into dragons unconcerned with ratios. Artists tear edges to make a decal that returns the sheet to the river. Bakers use parchment that ignores every standard and still fits the tray because human hands can persuade corners to behave. A storage drawer designed for 3 will happily host sketches and secrets that refuse to be named. The point of standards is not to prevent freedom, it is to allow it to start tidy. Even in the neatest offices, a single immaculate A4 will end the day with a coffee ring that looks like a pale planet. The paper forgives. It is extremely good at forgiveness. It will carry tomorrow's agenda with the same grace. We might ask why America keeps letter. Partly because habit is sturdy. Typewriter makers built carriages the width of 8.5 inches. Copier plates followed. File drawers were sized. Desks were sold. The nation took a nap. Upon waking, it preferred not to move the furniture. The difference between a foreign letter is small enough to ignore until it isn't. A paragraph spills onto an extra page. A margin vanishes, a staple sulks. The solutions are gentle. Expand, shrink, fit to printable area, breathe. You can hear printers talking to themselves, making tiny compromises for peace. Meanwhile, stationers sell pads marked with both rulers, inches along one edge, centimeters along the other, a bilingual diplomacy taught to children by geometry teachers who remember the Cold War and also chalked out the digital world, promised to retire paper, and instead taught it new tricks. PDF files are loyal to their original dimensions. Screens pretend to be sheets. Virtual margins imitate real ones so convincingly that we still reach for the upper right corner to turn a page. Office workers learn to print to a 3 for a big meeting and to a 5 for a pocket plan, scaling without complaint. Project managers discovered that a Gantt chart keeps its humor at a 2, but collapses into a crossword at a 4. Calendars grow to a 1 in January and shrink to a 4 by June, as hopes adjust to meetings. Students still pin A3 study guides above desks, where they serve as both information and wallpaper. Every so often, someone emails a resume in US letter to a European company, and a recruiter prints it on a 4 with a border that resembles optimism. The job often goes to someone who noticed the border and declined to care. I like the way paper sizes solve a problem we no longer notice. In the 19th century, a clerk had to ask what size to cut. Today, a machine knows because most of the world decided together. That decision lowers the volume of life. It is the opposite of trauma. It is constraint as comfort. The chain begins with a sheet dripping from a mold, or a ribbon streaming from a Virginia machine, and continues to a printer tray with an icon that looks like a little drawer, a 4, a 3 letter. You press the symbol you recognize. The sheet that arrives is hospitable to your hands. It stacks with its neighbors like a choir practicing sighs. If you explore old archives, you can see the transition. Early 20th century folders contain letters that lean in different directions. The papers meet at angles like polite strangers. After standards arrive, the files line up in placid rows. Margins become regular. The look of bureaucracy changes from handmade to modular, from patchwork to grid. The sameness is not boring when you think of what it saves. Minutes spent trimming, hours spent refolding, days spent inventing ways to put things away. A standard is simply a promise repeated until it becomes furniture. The square root 2 rectangle is a promise that when you have work, you will still recognize it. There are small curiosities to keep you awake just long enough to drift. The Japanese also use a series, but have used B series with slightly different dimensions because math enjoys regional cuisine. The international postcard size is a 6, which explains why postcards feel like a handful of someone else's afternoon. Banknotes ignore almost everything, choosing eccentric sizes for reasons that involve wallets, machines, and national personality. Artists buy pads labeled A3+, which is an extremely human thing to do. It says, "I love your system. I would like just a little more." Photo prints from the digital era favor 10-15 centimeters because cameras and memories negotiated a truce. Plotters eat EO rolled onto tubes that form later very useful swords for children supervising a fort. At night, a print room rests in a quiet that has its own grammar. Stacks of A4 sit like well-behaved bricks. A tray of A3 waits with the confidence of a larger sibling. In a drawer, Envelopes nested by the C-series pretend to be birds preparing to migrate. The guillotine dreams of straightness. The finishing table recalls a day of creasing that went so smoothly, the operator treated it to a fresh pad of cutting mats. Somewhere a label reads a 4 only, as if loyalty were a species of romance. The clocks are imprecise because paper doesn't mind. A draft under the door lifts the top sheet, which lets it fall again, performing the smallest possible bow. If you're awake to hear it, the loveliest fact is still Lichtenberg's, a rectangle that keeps its shape when you fold it. The world treated that as an engineering convenience. It is also an instruction for gentleness. You can reduce your day by half and still be proportionate. You can scale your plans and keep your outline. If people were paper, and on some afternoons in offices we are, then the square root to family is a reassurance in a drawer. Take a large intention, fold once, and continue. Take a stack of worries, align them, tap them against the desk until they agree, and slide them into an envelope that fits. We end where most documents end, signed, dated, clipped, and filed under a tab that says exactly what it needs to say and not a syllable more. The rectangle will wait there with the patience of fibers that learn to be a team. Tomorrow it may be scanned. The next day it may be recycled into tomorrow's rectangle. The week after that it may return as the wrapper around a new ream, cheerfully advertising its own destiny. Paper sizes, after all, are an agreement between trees and time about how to be useful without making noise. If you drift off now, the sheets will continue their quiet arithmetic without you. They will halve and double. They will line up. They will hold ink with a steadiness that does not insist on being thanked. And in the morning, if you need one, an A4 will be waiting at arm's length, perfectly ordinary, perfectly ready, with corners that do not mind being touched by sleepy hands. You might not expect a city to whisper to you through brass screws, but house numbers have been speaking in small numerals for a surprisingly long time. They announce themselves politely from lintels and gates, from enamel plates and painted stone, from mailboxes that tilt in the rain. If you find this soothing, and if you're somehow still awake by the time we reach the Viennese habit of painting numbers on corners, with a bucket and a ladder, you can subscribe for more of this gentle arithmetic, but please don't strain yourself. Numbers are patient. They will be here when you yawn. For a great deal of time there were no numbers at all. A messenger would be told to find the baker by the well, or the third house past the church where the widow keeps hens, which is a charming way to get lost. Medieval cities were maps of gossip. You navigated by reputation. Inns had signs you could read without reading an ox, a star, a hand, and some noble houses had names because noble houses collect nouns the way hedges collect sparrows. But numbers were rare. It was less that they had not been invented, more that they had not been invited to the party. In dense districts, a landlord might paint a symbol on every building in a row, a lily. A wheel then change it when tenants changed, the way you might change a doormat. Letters went astray softly, like socks. Mariners arrived with parcels addressed to near the bridge, facing south, and a clerk squinted at the compass through a window. The first sustained flirtation with numbering came with taxes, as so many practical arrangements do. Governments do not fall asleep. They count. In the mid-18th century, several European cities experimented with giving every building a sequential number so the census takers would not become poems. Vienna did it with gusto in the 1770s, painting big red numerals on houses as part of the conscription effort. Imagine a long, careful too, painted on plaster by a man on a wooden ladder while a cat licks its paw on a sill. The system ran continuously along streets and across them, so a number followed the previous one, even if you turned a corner, like a parade that forgot to stop marching. This made finding a house delightful if you loved mazes and less delightful if you had soup going cold. but it worked for lists, and lists are what states love. The numbers were not addresses as we think of them. They were identification marks. As if each house had been arranged into a regiment. Paris gave numbers to doors in the early 19th century with administrative drama, and then kept revising them with administrative calm. Even numbers on one side, odd on the other, with the count beginning at the end nearest the Seine, or sometimes nearest the city center because rivers move, at least socially. London, true to form, tried everything at once, and then codified whatever survived. Some streets ran numbers consecutively up one side and down the other like a badly laced shoe. Others split into odds and evens. Still others, after rebuilding, added letters 2-3A, 2-3B, as if addressing apartments by the alphabet were a gentleman's compromise. The tiny, quiet fact hiding in all this is that numbers solved a problem you can feel in your calves. They saved footsteps. Even when you don't know precisely where a house is, the gap between 82 and 96 tells you how much hope to carry. One microdrama you can safely enjoy without waking up is the invention of the enamel street plate. Paint fades in weather, stone erodes, handwriting wobbles on ladders. Enamel, coated metal fired until it gleams, can hold a number through decades of rain and remarks. In the 19th century, French blue plates with white numerals became a sort of civic jewelry. Germans preferred crisp black on white or white on black, often in the din type that looks like it could trim its own nails. The British indulged in ceramic tiles set into brickwork, the numerals a whisper darker than the clay. Italians flirted with terracotta and a red border that looks like a respectful blush. A child passing a wall could touch enamel 7 and feel both coolness and the sense of a rule that did not mind being petted. Every nation shaped numbers around its own ways of walking. In Spain, the count often begins at the end of the street closest to the city hall, as if the mayor's shadow were a ruler. In the United States, many cities adopted a grid with a 0 point. Philadelphia did it early, assigning numbered streets, east to west, named streets, north to south. A kind of giant multiplication table you could live inside. New York stacked numbers up and down Manhattan with the solidity of building blocks. 23rd. Street follows 22nd as surely as Tuesday follows Monday. It is not wildly imaginative, which is the point. Chicago numbered addresses by the mile so that 800 numbers equaled 1 mile. A person on a bicycle could compute distance without waking their phone. You begin to see the secret. An address is a sentence that tells you how to move, not just where to end, asterisk. Then there are the exceptions, the ones that make cartographers drink tea slowly. Japan addresses by blocks rather than streets. The streets are mere gaps between blocks and hardly worth naming. A block may contain several non-sequential numbers assigned in the order the buildings were erected, so a visitor follows a narrative rather than a sequence. People navigate by convenience stores and by habit. Kyoto, older than most notebooks, directs you by corners. 2 east, 1 south, like a chess problem in plaid. Rural Ireland historically used townlands ancient, wonderfully named areas such as Ballin Temple or Court Negrelli, so letters to Mary O'Neill. The Forge, Kiltartan, Cull Galway, reached Mary with surprising efficiency, because everyone knew Mary and the Forge knew everybody. Only in the last decade did she receive a formal code, which she answers politely but does not yet prefer. Numbers can be superstitious without committing to it openly. Some buildings skip 13, a tradition that begins in fear and continues in good manners. Elevators move from 12 to 14 as if pausing for a breath. In East Asia, 4 is sometimes avoided because its pronunciation resembles the word for death. Entire floors are renumbered with a discretion that signage designers enjoy as a small crossword. Meanwhile, in Italy, 17 takes the stage because the Roman numeral 17 can be rearranged to Vixi, I have lived, which sounds too finished. These omissions do not trick the cosmos, but they soothe tenants who have already met enough cosmic surprises. The mail carriers keep their own counsel and deliver to whatever box appears between 12 and 14. With the dignity of professionals, there's a quiet poetry in the odd-even convention. If numbers increase from the city center outward, the even side might catch more late sun, depending on your hemisphere, which means the odd side gets shade and therefore different plants, different nap strategies, different preservation of sofa fabric. On a rural road in the American Midwest, addresses often contain the distance from a baseline. 25,783 may look arbitrary, but secretly tells you how far wheat is from County Zero. Emergency services lobbied for this in the 1980s and 1990s in what was called 911 addressing, a campaign that turned the old Miller Place, Second Drive past the Big Cottonwood, into a coordinate the dispatcher could find without knowing the tree personally. The Big Cottonwood, unfazed, remained big. Sometimes streets are renumbered and everyone learns to shrug. Reconstruction in the 19th century often swapped a sequence for odds and evens. Rebuilding after bombings did it again. A shop might become 12 when it had always been 204, and the proprietor would write a note in the window, formerly 204. Letters to former numbers found them anyway for years. Because postal workers share a tribe with ravens, they remember shiny things and favors. When Paris revised parts of its numbering, some residents kept the old enamel plate beside the new one, like a portrait of a previous haircut. In older German towns, you can still see conscription numbers faintly under current ones, ghosts in careful red. Cities are palimpsests wherever you look, not just in grand plans. But in these tiny, persistent arithmetic scars, fonts like to be involved. The numerals on Berlin plates used DIN 1451, a typeface invented for legibility on roads and trains, calm as a ruler and excellent at staying awake when drivers do not. London house numbers sometimes use gill sans, which appears to have been groomed with a clean comb. In the Netherlands, you see a lot of compact grotesques, the digits squared off as if designed by a bicycle. In New York, you can still find hand-painted numerals from the 1930s with improbable waistlines. A 6 swells like a tired teacup. The style of the number announces the year a building last took itself seriously. An entire thesis could be written about the serif on a 2, and perhaps it has been. If you are writing it now, this is an excellent soundtrack for doing so. Of course. Numbers are also instructions for hands and feet. A courier does not need poetry. They need a sequence that forgives distraction. You can test a city by how it rewards a person on a rainy evening holding a parcel and a pen, shoulders up around their ears, looking for number 146B. A forgiving city places even numbers on one side and odd on the other, increases predictably, and labels corners where appetite would otherwise turn a person toward noodles rather than the address. Less forgiving cities hide 146B up a mews behind 148, where 146 are rents. A garage in 146C is a basil plant. The courier sighs and becomes a better person, or at least stronger in the legs. There is a miniature anthropology at every door. Brass numerals polished by generations of cloths signal neighbors with Saturday habits. Painted numerals done with a stencil say rental, with a kindness that turns into deposit receipts. Enamel plates bolted into stone say permanent until a drill says otherwise. Some homeowners add flourishes, a ceramic tile with a blue 23 that looks best near lemons. A wrought iron, 7 inches that can catch sleeves. Wood digits that swell in rain and shrink in argument. In certain districts you will find no 1/2, because the building is a slice inserted later. A neat little rational number living between two integers with the breezy confidence of a fraction wearing a hat. A building that is both 12 and 12A, depending on which entrance you use, is not lying. It is simply multilingual ** the postal code, which appears new and numerical and modern, is really just a polite invitation to sort. In the United Kingdom, the code can locate a handful of houses, sometimes a single one. It is the city's internal whisper to itself. In Germany, the 5-digit PLZ tells the mail where to stretch before it starts to jog. In the United States, the zip +4 promises precision and delivers good intentions. Canada alternates letter and number like a chessboard so that H2X1Y4 looks at once empirical and festive. None of these supplant the door number. They simply form a choir behind it. The envelope arrives, tired of the trip, and rests on the correct map because the tiny plate above the bell button told the truth and the postie believed it. I like the arithmetic of distances embedded in addresses. In some cities, the 100 block tells you the cross street. The 2300 block meets 23rd Street. In others, cardinal directions are smuggled into quadrant letters. So NW and Psi stand at the end of addresses like weather vanes. The best systems allow you to imagine the walk before you take it. 1325 announces a midpoint between 13th and 14th. 4702 says decisively near 47th even side. Probably a porch with 2 chairs because that is the density at 4702. Imagine combining this with the sound of your steps. 4 steps to a slab, 3 slabs to a drive. You are already halfway out of the present. A small detour since we are drifting. House names never surrendered entirely to numbers. In Britain, you still encounter Rose Cottage, proudly without numerals, which sends drivers to the right street and then into a meditative search among roses. In parts of Italy and Greece, a place might be simply the White House, which is not a political joke, just a paint description promoted to an identity. In Iceland, there are few surnames in the usual sense, so a letter to Harpa at the house painted the color of the cold sea might arrive because everyone knows Harpa and the sea teaches the color. These exceptions are not errors. They are the city stretching like a cat before lying comfortably in its numeric basket again, renumbering ceremonies, deserve their own sleepy footnote. In the late 19th century, Prague introduced a dual system. Conscription numbers in red and orientation numbers in blue, the latter increasing along the street, the former continuous within a district. For a time both were used. Postmen carried 2 sets of spectacles. Doors were both plates like medals. Visitors learned very slowly, as visitors do. Eventually, the conscription numbers performed a dignified retirement, but you can still spot. There are traces above arches if you let your eyes mistake lichen for ink. A historian can date a renovation by which plate the stucco embraces. A child can still trace both with a finger and feel 2 kinds of order in 1 minute. All this talk of order hides a pleasant shabbiness, because cities are never as tidy as their plans. A renovation moves a doorway and the number follows it like a dog. A laneway receives a new name because cafes have multiplied there like legends. A corner building declares itself 1 to 3 and means it, especially at rent review time. A developer adds a tower that requires 1,000, so the unit on the first floor becomes 1001 because boosterism is a form of mathematics too. A leafy suburb renumbers to ensure that emergency vehicles can find cul-de-sacs. The neighborhood. WhatsApp group complains briefly and then returns to exchanging plum recipes. What remains is the daily choreography. Someone reads a number on a parcel, looks up, finds its twin near bow, and presses gently. If you are still awake, here's a very small miracle. Odd and even numbers, facing each other across asphalt. Create a dialogue of symmetry that your brain enjoys without telling you. The numbers meet like dancers, 31 bows to 32, 33 nods to 34. up the street until the rhythm is interrupted by a park, which counts as an elegant pause. You rarely think, I am witnessing bilateral civic poetry because you have groceries. But the feeling that a street is legible, that it likes you, comes from this math. When an alley interrupts the sequence, your attention perks in the pleasant way attention does when a song adds a HANDCLAP dot at night. When a neighborhood goes quiet, the numbers glow faintly where porch lights catch them. The enamel plates breathe out the day's weather. The painted digits consider their next code. The brass screws cool at different speeds, which is the sort of fact that makes engineers sigh happily. Delivery scooters tick as they contract. A fox may pass, unread, but not unreading. Foxes know more about routes than they let on. Somewhere a dishwasher ends and a street lamp takes him off into its minor astronomy. A single window stays lit while someone adds apt4f to a form with the concentration of a small prayer. Behind the simplicity of a number is a chain of agreements. Surveyors stretched lines, councils voted. Printers cast numerals in tin and later in vinyl. Streets were paved, then repaved. A municipal worker in a high-visibility jacket measured with a tape while their colleague held the other end and silently counted fence panels. The plates arrived in boxes with packing straw. Someone drilled the holes at a polite distance from the edge, because you always drill at a polite distance from the edge. Someone else wiped dust from the face and stepped back and said, yes. The yes is the sound that keeps cities from fraying. We can end, if ending is the right word for something that mostly continues, with a thought about the kindness of predictability. If you have ever arrived in a strange city with a bag, a tired spine, and a piece of paper that says 48, you know the relief when the street begins at 2 and counts upward in steady twos like a parent calming a child. Odds to the left, evens to the right, numbers growing the way days do without flourish, without panic. You pass 36, then 38, then 40, and your step gets quieter because the distance between 40 and 48 is not a mystery but a measure. The city does not love you exactly. It simply keeps a promise it made before you were born. You reach the door. The plate says 48 in enamel or paint or brass, in a font that has opinions but no quarrels. You press the bell. Somewhere deep inside, something wakes and hurries gently toward you. And if you sleep now, the numbers will keep their watch, counting neither sheep nor citizens, just holding their places, polite rectangles of certainty in the soft arithmetic of the night.